Welcome to the second episode in our webcast series, Digital Health Dialogues, where we invite thought leaders to tell us more about their experience and insights in this ever-growing space. Today, we turn our attention to the presence and future of oncology research. This is a field where digital infrastructure, data quality, patient experience, and regulatory readiness intersects with urgent and complex topics. Our guest today brings exceptional insights into these challenges. Jennifer Webster is the VP of Evidence Generation Platforms and Partnerships at Pfizer. She's leading efforts in real-world data, partnerships worldwide, evidence generation systems, and real-world data and real-world evidence innovation. She has a strong background in data analysis and healthcare analytics, previously holding roles at Kaiser Permanente, Integra Connect, and Qualcomm. Jennifer holds a BA in chemistry and studied statistics. Her work focuses on integrating real-world evidence into healthcare decision-making and drug development at scale, and is an advocate beyond her role at Pfizer. Together, we'll look at how cancer data is captured, where is the value of captured data, and what does it take to turn clinical notes into evidence that matters for research, for policy, and for every individual patient affected by cancer. So, Jen, wonderful to have you here. Thanks for being here in Berlin in our office at Data for Life. Let's begin maybe with some basics of real-world data in oncology. What is so typical about oncology data that are captured across real-world data sources? Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about completeness and standardization of these different data sets.
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here in Berlin with you all and really thrilled to be part of this conversation. As you mentioned, oncology data is, I think, both different and further ahead than healthcare data that we're using for basically any other therapeutic area. One of the first places, starting with really the work that Flatiron did in the US, that we saw deep investments in making real-world data more complete, higher quality, started in oncology. And where that started, for Flatiron anyway, was with an army of humans whose job it was to take data that had historically been captured in notes and put that in structured data fields so that we all could use it for research. What you saw come out of that were a number of really impactful and innovative regulatory submissions. I would not appropriately be representing Pfizer if I didn't mention the Ibrance male breast cancer approval that we got based off of that data. But I think the other thing that you really see in oncology is it is the preeminent area for healthcare and pharmaceutical innovation right now. And so the data is different. It is, in general, more complete, and that work is going from really being managed by humans to increasingly being led by computers, NLP, AI, et cetera. But the other piece of this is there's so much demand for data. The shape of the oncology therapeutic landscape is really changing. We are moving from needing just kind of structured data about the disease process to needing more and more really multimodal precision medicine data, biomarkers, genomics, et cetera. And so there's both the opportunity and I think really the demand for increasing amounts of data and increasingly high quality data. I think the other thing that we see really come out in oncology is how important it is to get truly global data. We may have started with Flatiron and with data sources that were really based in the US, but what we found is that those data sources, particularly in oncology, don't always scale very well to Asia, even to parts of Europe, to Africa, et cetera. And so we know we need to be bringing in truly global data to help inform our global strategies. And I think as we saw happen kind of in the first wave of real-world data adoption, we're going to see as this moves to be a global phenomenon, oncology is really going to lead the way.
Wonderful. Listening to you, it almost sounds like all the problems have been already solved. But I mean, we clearly know that there are some challenges and issues like the difference between RCT data, real-world data, but also fragmentation, the lack of longitudinality in certain areas, and of course, diversity and even basic things as mapping or different concepts. Can you maybe talk about some of the challenges you've encountered and maybe also some best practices that you've learned during the process?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I think we have to think about challenges in two ways. Some of them are purely structural. We capture different data in a clinical trial than we capture in the real world. And unless we are willing to make almost a global effort to bring those two things together, that's going to continue to be the case for a long time. We don't get RECIST scores to measure progression in the real world. That's not a protocol that's done outside of a clinical trial. People want that data or something that approximates it. We end up using real world approximations. I think this is a place where the methodologist can help us, right? How do we compare a clinical trial recurrence with a real world recurrence? And how can the epidemiologists and statisticians help us understand how those two things that are trying to measure the same underlying biology, how do they relate to each other? So we're always going to have these structural problems. Some of these are artifacts. Data is collected in dozens, maybe hundreds of systems by the time we start talking about consumer systems. None of those systems are terribly well connected to each other. As we continue to bring more data online, and I think, being here in Berlin, as EHDS comes online and we start to see more data coming from Europe, we need to make sure that we're not just thinking about making data available, but making it integratable. I don't know if that's a particularly good word, but building those integrations between those data sets so that we can link lab data to EHR data, to imaging data, to genomics data. One of the things that we found in the US is that putting the patient at the center of that and allowing patients to really mediate the collection and connections of data is a really effective way for us to think about doing that. There's obviously also really good tech solutions, right? One of the things technology is really good at is helping us to make those connections. We want to make sure it's being done in a way that's consistent with patients' understanding of how their data is being used, and also HCP's understanding of how the data they're generating is being integrated into the broader kind of research ecosystem.
Great. You already brought up some topics that we'll explore in a little bit, like geographic expansion, diversity, and patient centricity. But before we go there, you mentioned that Flatiron was a humongous effort in manual labor. Now, these days, we have NLP, we have generative AI, we have large language models that promise to give access to the plus 80% of unstructured, untapped data. Can you maybe explore about that, where we are and what your experience is?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I will say, first of all, in my current role, I'm not responsible for this work, but in a prior role, I was responsible for the data model for a company called Integra Connect. So I had with a team of engineers implementing some pretty rudimentary NLP, and then a team of curators. And I will say, I think we're going to see those people continuing to work really closely together for a long time. What I believe we are starting to see happen is the NLP and the AI starting to take over the things that are relatively easy to do, that don't require a lot of judgment. So things like staging tend to be captured fairly well. Biomarkers tend to be captured fairly well. Maybe not in structured data, but they're written down in a note somewhere that an AI agent can be trained to go pull out, and maybe some subset of those can be validated by a person. There's still some much more complicated data, particularly in oncology, and here I'm talking about recurrence, progression, right? Some of these events that really do require a judgment call. The technical definition of progression in most clinical trials is an increase in tumor size of 20%. So it's not even enough to necessarily say, oh, the tumor has grown, right? The tumor is supposed to have grown a certain amount. It's going to be a while before we see, I think, AI and machines being able to replace highly trained humans and making those sorts of judgment calls. And that tends to be, when we're evaluating an oncology data set, one of the things we look most closely at is the inter-rater reliability and the accuracy of things like response and progression. And so that's the gold standard we're working to for these systems. I believe for the first time in 20 years, we're making progress, right? This is not a new problem. This is not a new solution, but I think we're starting to see some very good progress. Hopefully that frees up the humans to spend less time on the things that are relatively easy to find and more time really focused on that high quality data that's really hard to extract.
Very great overview. And if you might dive a little bit deeper, as a clinician, I encounter frequently that in the notes we document not what we mean, but actually what we need to document in terms of billing and in terms of codes. Do we have enough nodes that really represent the patient journey and really the clinical problem to train the models on nodes, not just on frequency of occurrence and correlations, but really on the medical matter that underlies the patient's problem?
It's such a good question. I honestly don't know the answer. Again, I think if you think about stage, if you think about things that are highly prescribed by a pathway that's pretty well accepted across big swaths of countries or continents, probably. But most oncologists that I know in the US are still dictating their note outside the patient's room before they move into a room with the next patient. And what they're dictating can be very specific to the voice of that oncologist. And they're doing it still with the idea that that one note isn't for research, right? That note exists to remind them what they need to know next time they're standing outside of that patient's room and needing to make a decision. And so I imagine what we're going to find, particularly as we move into this truly global data economy, is that we don't have enough information to train models for every data point that we want to be able to structure.
So then if we look outside of the US, is there maybe a particular country that is better in taking clinical notes and that could help us to train these models?
Oh, that's a really good question. I actually suspect that we will find some of those answers in Asia. I think, and I know Data for Life has some partners that are working in this space. I think one of the things that we've seen happen in Asia, there is an enormous plethora of EMRs. But what has really impressed me as I've been traveling in Japan and Korea is you have these physicians who sometimes are seeing dozens and dozens of patients in a day for a very short period of time. But in 5 or 7 minutes, they're able to have that conversation with that patient, make diagnostic and treatment decisions, and get everything documented effectively in the EHR, and then move on to the next patient. And they're not doing what happens in the US and spending 5 hours charting later at night. And so I know some of these precision health information systems, I think, are well designed to start capturing kind of the next generation of information. I also suspect we are about to see another wave of oncology EHR development in the US and in Europe. Now that we have access to kind of all of these AI-first technologies. The last version of OncoEMR, Flatiron's EMR, launched in 2015? It's been a decade, right? We're probably due for another round of innovation that hopefully takes advantage of the technology that's available to us now.
Great. And then maybe to now look at the point of patient centricity. I mean, there's some like basic challenges such as what is pain control after discharge, right? And where can the data come from? Do you see a chance in like patient-derived data, and what is your experience, and where do you see the journey going?
I mean, we're seeing enormous enthusiasm. I think you see initiatives across the world, really. China, Japan, certainly here in Europe, and even in the US, where patients are being empowered both to communicate with their regulators, right? Many drug approvals through our regulators now include either in-person conversations with patients or an option for patients to participate in submitting those drug applications to the regulators, so their point of view is a part of that decision process. We are also seeing in the US the rise of what we've been calling patient-mediated data. In the US, under the current interoperability regulations, patients are given the opportunity to consent to have their healthcare data from both their health systems and their payers shared with any application of their choosing under a FHIR standard. We're seeing patients really adopt and engage with this technology in a way that is allowing them to do what we've actually really always asked them to do, which is to be the center and the guiding force of their healthcare journey. But more and more, they're also bringing that data to research. So there's companies like Picnic Health that are entirely patient-mediated data. They're building out registries with this patient mediation. I think we're seeing similar models starting to happen across Europe under EHDS, where patient consent is one of the ways that you can safely share data under GDPR. And I think that the models that we are seeing, the economic models for how does data move and how does data get used, are actually much more ethical. And we start to get a much more virtuous kind of feedback loop in that ecosystem when patients and providers are aware of what we're using their data for and actively participating. I think the other piece of sort of what we would consider at Pfizer to be patient experience data that we're seeing used a lot are formal patient preference studies. So actually asking patients these discrete choice experiments where we effectively ask them, would you be willing to have this side effect if it gave you this much more efficacy, right? Would you be willing to have a rash if you had 6 months more overall survival on this oncology drug? And getting answers to those questions and starting to really understand in a formal, controlled scientific way what matters to providers, to patients, to caregivers, to payers. That information is increasingly going to regulators, both the EMA and the FDA, and I think is starting to shape the way that drug programs are designed.
Very interesting. And this concept of patient experience data might be novel to our audience. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more how you capture the data? Is it free text or is it really just coded answers comparing two groups, or maybe some more insights? Unless you spill any secrets here.
No. I mean, I think it's all of the above.
Yeah.
I think we have very structured ways that we do this, these discrete choice experiments that happen in the patient preference world. I think most people will also be familiar with patient-reported outcomes data, which can be highly validated instruments, but can also be less structured, more informal feedback. We're also starting to see the rise of what we would broadly consider to be patient insights data, which can be sourced from social media and other places where we're actually seeing patient stories, seeing patient experiences with given diseases or drugs, and starting to bring that in to help kind of inform the drug development process, understand patients' real experience.
Great. And you mentioned FHIR before, and maybe we can shift into maybe some of the technical parts of interoperability and the standards that are commonly used. I mean, as you know, in Germany, it seems to be like a FHIR first environment, but I mean, there are also advocates for OMOP. Maybe your view on this challenge or this competition?
I think that we're going to look back in 5 years and wonder why there ever was a conflict here. Our view, because this is a bit of a tongue twister, but Pfizer is also trying to be FHIR first. Our view is that FHIR is the standard we should be using for data in motion, and OMOP is the standard we should be using for data at rest and in the analytic process. And both of those things should be in conversation with each other. We actually installed at Pfizer our first FHIR server earlier this year. We are starting to use it to move product information, both internally and with some of our external partners. We are excited to start moving things like real-world data with FHIR in the next couple of years. But we are also an OMOP institution, and so our internal analyses are increasingly based on OMOP standards, using standard packages from Odyssey. We see them as really compatible.
Great. And if we extend that, I mean, you've been one of the leaders in validating digital endpoints, also catering to the aspect of patient centricity. Can you tell us a little bit more how that fits into that picture?
Well, I mean, one of the great things about FHIR, right, is I think particularly in the US, but hopefully as EHDS comes out increasingly in Europe, is how patient-friendly it is, right? FHIR becomes the language by which in the US patients get access to their data. They are able, through these patient-mediated data companies, to donate their data for research or authorize their data for research. They're building out now, I think, real impactful personalized health records using data that's transitioned via FHIR. And so there's a lot of patient-centric work that simply wouldn't be possible if these FHIR standards didn't exist and if that community hadn't been doing so much work with patients for so long. I think there's probably more work for us to do with patients on the OMOP side, helping patients understand real-world data, real-world evidence generation, why it matters, why standards matter there. I think what's happening in the EU with Darwin is really fascinating. where for the first time we have a regulator that's generating their own evidence. I know they have patients involved. I'd be really curious maybe to know what the patients involved in Darwin, how they're kind of responding to the types of evidence that are being generated there. I think there's a much more fulsome conversation for us to be having and making sure that patients really have a seat at the table. So when we are generating evidence, they're bought into what we're doing.
One more question regarding the digital endpoints. Last time I checked on the DIME webpage, they have reported 505 endpoints, of which only a fraction is validated, and I don't know, only a fraction is for oncology. Can you give us some more context here?
I mean, there's so much work to be done here, right? I really think that, and we've seen this interesting shift that's happened as you track from maybe 2020 to today. When we used to talk about data quality or evidence quality, we would talk about things like how many rows in a table are filled in, right? How much data missing is there? Now, when we talk about data quality, we are talking more about provenance. Do we know where the data came from? Are all of the endpoints validated? Or should I say, are the exposures, the covariates, and the endpoints validated? These are the things that the FDA is telling us in our guidances and the EMA that they're very concerned about. I don't think that there are well-established ways for us to do this work. We're starting to do it in pieces. We have a couple of digital endpoints in phase 2 trials at Pfizer that have been validated using clinical wearables. We'd like to try to replicate that work in kind of a bring your own device environment using consumer wearables, but this is a long road ahead of us, and I think probably an opportunity for a company like Data for Life or somebody else to come in and really start, how do we streamline this validation process? And what do we do if we decide an endpoint that somebody's using isn't validated, right? Is there like a rescue pathway to bring that back so that we can really understand what does this study mean even in the absence of validated endpoints or even validated exposure definitions?
Great. And so once you have the digital endpoints, once you collect the data, at some point you have to put them in the platform, analyze the data. But here, I mean, there are challenges, especially when it comes to oncology. Could you maybe just give a snapshot of the current status and where you see the journey going?
You know, I have people ask me all the time, why should I have faith in real-world data? How do I know that this real-world evidence is actually of high quality? And partially because I'm from Pfizer, one of the things I say to them is nobody questions our male breast cancer results for Ibrance, because that was an exceptionally well-designed study. The protocol was pre-disclosed, so everybody knew exactly what we were going to do, and then the analysis plan followed the protocol. When you treat real-world evidence generation like real research, like a real study, and you do it to that level of quality, people don't question it. I think where we get into trouble is sometimes we try to see real-world evidence as a cheaper, faster alternative, and people end up putting out substandard protocols, substandard results, or even just not following all of the transparency pathways. And that leaves room for us to question what's actually been done. And so my emphasis would really be on let's treat the research we're doing like research, let's follow best practices, and let's make sure that we are both communicating and disseminating about the results that we get in a way that's incredibly transparent.
Great. Maybe now we can talk about where Odyssey came from and the meaning of Odyssey as an organization. It started as a public-private partnership. Where do you see that kind of collaboration and cooperation outside of Odyssey, maybe, also maybe in your global experience?
I think that these public-private partnerships can have such a big impact. They also require a certain amount of commitment to participate in. So I would actually put Odyssey and FHIR in really similar places here. We have these communities that come together and they meet weekly or every other week, and they're deep in the problems and they're solving all of these technical things with technical solutions. We need people to keep doing that work. But there's some people who just want, they're sitting in a procurement role in a pharma company, and they just say, hey, I love this idea of FHIR. I love this idea of OMOP. How do I, in my role, invest in solutions that use those technologies. And I don't think that those sort of next level solutions exist. If you think about the innovation curve, we're still kind of at the shallow part where we want all of the early adopters who are willing to not just invest money, but a lot of their time. I think it's about developing and really leaning into those solutions for this part of the curve where people really want to be involved, they want to be choosing the right things, but they don't want to have to show up to a meeting every week. They just want to buy a product that works. But they love to do it in a way that's consistent with all of these standards.
And so then, if you look at different industries, different spaces, I mean, at the end, you have a consolidation. It's like Coke versus Pepsi, McDonald's versus Burger King. Do you see any kind of consolidation in the real-world data space?
I actually think we're in the opposite cycle right now. I think right now we're diverging. I think we are 3 or 4 years away from that consolidation. It will come. But right now what's happening is there's data platforms everywhere. There's new data companies everywhere. EHDS is driving a lot of this. A lot of it's happening in Europe. But we're also seeing really tremendous changes in the data space in the US. We've had a couple of very big public breaches in the US recently that have made people a little bit wary about sharing data. We've had a couple of big players kind of pull out of the market in the US. And so what we're seeing is a lot of small but kind of untested companies come up. I think the companies that can successfully navigate through this time can find a couple of big partners, can have quick, meaningful impact, are going to be the ones that we're still going to see be around in 3 or 4 years, and will be part of, I think, that future that includes all of the EHDS, all of the work that's happening in Asia, and then whatever the next generation of data looks like in the US.
Great. And since we're here in Germany, can you share any insights or experience that you have, or maybe some anecdote about Germany and the real-world data in Germany?
Real-world data in Germany is a challenge. We are obviously very excited about the German market, right? It's a key market for Pfizer. There's some incredible healthcare providers here. There's some even incredible like digital application developers that have emerged in Germany. Access to data in Germany remains a bit of a challenge. I think the last time I had a conversation with a data supplier here in Berlin, they told me they had access to 1.5% of the data generated in Germany, which obviously is not quite enough for us to be thinking about more than kind of an innovation relationship with them. I have heard recently, though, that there have been some changes and that the German regulators might be thinking about opening things up a little bit more. And so we are anxious to be a part of what we see starting to happen. At ISPOR this year, my team has reported to me that for the first time, people are starting to talk about German data really becoming more fluid, more available. So we're excited to see more of that come online.
Fantastic. And I mean, we do our best to support this trend and change that percentage. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. Maybe for our last question, since we are also approaching Christmas, if you had a magic wand, what change would you like to see in terms of oncology data and maybe also more in general for real-world data? Where do you see something that could have a real big impact and is maybe down the line, but with the right partners, feasible and possible?
I think the change I would be most excited to see in oncology data, I'm going to list 2. One I think is possible. I don't know that I need a magic wand, maybe just time. One is for us to actually treat the oncology healthcare environment more like the research lab that it is. Right? We often say now, and I said earlier today, the point of the healthcare note is to facilitate this visit and the next one. But we all know now, I think across the US, across Europe, that this data that we are generating via standard of care healthcare is being used to drive research. So let's acknowledge that. Let's build RECIST into standard of care. Let's bring the endpoints in that we know are going to be necessary for research so that we can get as much as we possibly can out of the data that's being generated by these patients. I think the second piece, and perhaps you can help me with this one, is breaking down some of the silos between what has been historically healthcare data and historically consumer data. So Pfizer has an asset in development right now for cancer cachexia. We have a digital endpoint as part of our phase 2 trial looking at activity as measured by a wearable. We would love to be able to easily integrate a patient's healthcare data with the data that's being collected by their Apple Watch or their Fitbit or their Whoop or whatever, and use that to really help capture that endpoint in real-world care as well. It's actually a really challenging thing to do at any kind of scale, and we're seeing this real blurring now of what has historically been the healthcare world and the consumer world. Patients have wearables. They can, in the US anyway, order their own lab tests. Healthcare is becoming much more of a consumer good. And if we lose visibility into that space, there's a huge part of the healthcare journey that's simply not going to be available to us via real world data anymore. And it's really going to impact the research that we can do. So I'd love to be able to make sure that we can still see that full continuum.
Wonderful. So that brings us to the end of this webcast. Thank you, Jennifer, for your insights and walking us through the reality of dealing with oncology data. I think what was really clear is that the traditional approach of very narrow inclusion-exclusion criteria, like very confined study designs, has still its value. But I think in a digitized world, with all the technology at hand, we can't solve it just by ourselves. We have to find the right partners, be open, and also look beyond our borders. So have the demand and also the desire to represent a diverse data set that doesn't only look at the main signals, but also at the small signals that are important to explore. Because, I mean, the world is not just America or Europe, right? And I think it was very clear that technology is not a differentiator and a divisor, but it's an opportunity to bring not just interoperability on the technology platform, but in a broader space. And I think dialogue is important, and open source approaches that prevent vendor lock-in. And I think we here at Data for Life really want to create equality and equal access to technology solutions. But we need partners who help us to focus on the right direction and also bring the patient centricity into a very technical-oriented company. And so that's great that we have this dialogue and that you are so open to talk to us and work with us. So we are very excited about the next steps in this collaboration. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you very much for attending this second episode in our webcast series. Stay tuned for our next episode with another special guest. Thank you very much.